It was a quiet evening in the city, the kind where the streets seemed almost empty, yet every sound felt louder than usual. Streetlights cast a soft yellow glow, painting long shadows across the sidewalks. The air was cool, carrying a faint scent of rain from earlier in the day. People were hurrying home from work, some laughing on their phones, others lost in thought, walking alone. Among them was a woman who moved with a quiet confidence, though the weight of the day still lingered in her shoulders. She had spent the afternoon attending meetings, discussing plans for community projects and helping organize support for local programs. Her heart felt full from the work she loved, and she was looking forward to getting home, having a warm meal and resting. As she walked, her mind drifted to the projects she had planned. She thought about the families who would benefit, the children who would get new opportunities, and the people who had trusted her to make a difference. She felt proud, not for herself, but because of the work she knew mattered. Her shoes made soft taps against the pavement, a gentle rhythm that matched the quiet of the evening. She didn't notice much around her, focused on her thoughts, the small notebook in her bag filled with ideas and schedules. Then, almost without warning, she felt the presence of two police officers walking briskly toward her. Their expressions were serious, eyes scanning her with an intensity that immediately made her pause. She could see the way they looked at her, the way their shoulders tensed, the way their steps seemed to close the space between them faster than was necessary. She took a deep breath, steadying herself, reminding herself to stay calm. She had faced difficult situations before, though never quite like this. "Evening," one of the officers said, his tone clipped and sharp. It wasn't a greeting. It felt like a warning. The woman nodded politely, trying not to give them reason to escalate anything. "Evening, officers," she replied calmly. Her voice was firm, measured, respectful. She knew that how she carried herself mattered in moments like this. "You live around here?" the second officer asked. There was an edge to his words, as if he expected her to stumble over the answer. She answered without hesitation. "Yes, just a few blocks that way," she said, pointing toward the street leading to her apartment. The officers exchanged a quick glance, subtle but heavy with meaning. The woman noticed, though she didn't show it. She had learned long ago to read people, to understand when someone's eyes or tone held more than their words. She felt the tension in the air, the invisible weight of assumptions pressing down on her. She could sense that they were making judgments, assumptions about who she was and what she might be doing on the street at this hour. It was unfair, it was wrong, and she knew it, but she also knew that anger would not help. One of the officers stepped closer. "We need to ask you a few questions," he said, his voice authoritative. "Just a few questions." The woman nodded again, her hands relaxed at her sides. She wanted to cooperate, to show that she had nothing to hide. She could feel the gaze of a few people passing by, their curiosity piqued by the tension. Some slowed down, glancing over their shoulders, sensing that something was happening but not quite understanding what. "Do you have any identification on you?" the first officer asked. She reached into her bag, retrieving her wallet carefully, and handed it over. She could see the hesitation in their eyes as they examined it, the brief flicker of judgment that passed between them. As they looked at her ID, she noticed that their attention was drawn more to her appearance than her credentials. The skin she had been born with, the way she looked, seemed to carry a weight she had known all her life, a weight she carried quietly but unmistakably. She had encountered prejudice before, of course, but each time it stung, leaving a reminder of the world she navigated every day. Tonight she felt it again, in the narrowed eyes, in the clipped words, in the subtle tension that suggested she was being judged unfairly. The officers began asking questions: where she was coming from, where she was going, why she was walking alone. She answered each one honestly, carefully, making sure to keep her tone respectful. She could sense that they weren't listening as much as they were sizing her up, looking for inconsistencies or excuses. She realized that no matter what she said, no matter how truthful she was, their minds had already formed conclusions based on who she was, not what she was doing. She stayed calm, though her heart was beating faster than usual. She had faced challenges before, but this was different. This was not about mistakes or misunderstandings. It was about assumptions that cut deeper because they were rooted in something she could never change, and yet she knew she could not let fear show. She could not give them reason to escalate or to justify their bias. She had to remain composed, strong, and dignified. The officers continued to press, asking more questions, their tone sharp, their posture rigid. She could feel the judgment in every word, the invisible barrier they had placed between themselves and her. She noticed the few people still walking by, some slowing down to watch, unsure whether to intervene, whether to say something. She felt their eyes, their silent concern, and it gave her a small sense of solidarity. She wasn't entirely alone in this moment, even though the officers wanted her to feel that way. As the questioning went on, a small misunderstanding arose. One of the officers noticed an item in her bag, a notebook, paper sticking out. He reached for it without asking, and she instinctively put her hand out, politely but firmly. "That's mine," she said calmly. "Please don't touch it without asking." The officer paused, frowning, clearly annoyed by her insistence. "We're just making sure," he said. But there was no warmth in his voice, no reassurance, only authority. The woman took a deep breath, reminding herself to stay grounded. She knew that this was about more than the notebook. It was about their perception of her, about the invisible prejudices that influenced their every word and action. She stayed polite, stayed firm, and refused to show fear, even though every nerve in her body was tense. Minutes passed like hours. Each question, each glance, each movement felt heavy with judgment. Yet through it all, she maintained her composure. She spoke calmly, clearly and respectfully, refusing to give them any excuse to escalate the situation. Her presence, steady and unwavering, was a quiet assertion of dignity against the unfairness she faced. She knew that being calm was not weakness. It was strength. Finally, the officers paused, looking at her ID again, exchanging another quick glance. She could see the subtle shift, the hesitation that suggested a crack in their assumptions. For a brief moment, she wondered if they would recognize her accomplishments, her role in the community, her identity beyond the assumptions of the evening. She didn't know yet, but she could sense that the story was only beginning. Around them, the city carried on. A few cars passed slowly, their headlights casting fleeting shadows. People walked by, some glancing at the scene, others pretending not to notice. The night seemed calm, but the tension lingered, invisible yet palpable. The woman stood there, steady and composed, holding herself with the quiet strength that had carried her through countless challenges before. She knew that what happened next could change everything, either for the worse, if prejudice prevailed, or for the better, if understanding finally broke through. She looked at the officers, meeting their eyes, and saw a flicker of doubt in them, though it was faint and uncertain. She stayed calm, letting the silence stretch for a moment, giving space for reflection, for reason, for the possibility of seeing her as more than a stereotype. Her heart beat steadily, her breathing measured, her mind focused on the simple truth. She was a human being deserving of respect, dignity, and fairness, no matter the assumptions others made. The evening air seemed to hold its breath with her. Every detail, the glow of the streetlights, the quiet hum of distant traffic, the soft whisper of wind through the trees, felt heightened, as if the city itself was aware of the tension and waiting for what would come next. She shifted her weight slightly, ready to answer more questions, to explain herself further, to assert her presence in a world that often judged too quickly. She was ready, calm, and unshakable. And in that quiet tension, the story of the night began to unfold, the story of assumptions, of bias, of resilience, and of the quiet strength that carried her through the first moments of an encounter that could have gone many ways. She knew she had already begun to make an impact simply by standing there, refusing to let fear or anger dictate her response. She was human, she was strong, and she was more than the assumptions of the night. The air seemed to grow heavier as the officers continued to scrutinize her. Every word they spoke carried a tone that felt more like judgment than a question. The woman stood still, her hands at her sides, her face calm but her mind racing. She knew that staying composed was crucial. She had learned from past experiences that reacting with anger only made the situation worse, and yet she could feel the weight of unfairness pressing down on her chest. Each assumption, each glance from the officers, reminded her of the countless times society had judged her before truly knowing her. "You're walking alone this late," one officer said, his voice almost accusatory. "Is that safe?" He looked at her as if he expected her to admit guilt or wrongdoing, as if the simple act of being out at night could justify suspicion. She nodded politely, choosing her words with care. "I'm fine," she said calmly. "I know my route and I take precautions. I appreciate your concern, but I've walked these streets many times before." Her tone was firm but respectful. the kind of voice that demanded to be heard without raising a fight. The other officer stepped closer, his face stern. "You say that, but what exactly were you doing out here? Where were you before this?" His eyes darted around as if he was searching for evidence to support his assumptions. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I was attending a community meeting," she said. "We discussed local programs to help children and families. I was returning home afterward." She held his gaze steadily, refusing to let the fear she felt show outwardly. The officers exchanged a quick, subtle glance that she noticed immediately. Their expressions hardened, but she could see a flicker of uncertainty in their eyes. It was faint, almost hidden behind their professional masks, but it was there. She understood what it meant. They were realizing that the story she told didn't fit the narrative they had already created in their minds, and that realization seemed to irritate them more than anything else. "You were at a meeting, huh?" The first officer asked, his tone skeptical. "What kind of meeting was it?" "Who organized it?" She answered calmly, giving as much information as she could without hesitation. "It was organized by a local nonprofit. We focus on education and community support. Many people attended, including teachers, parents, and community leaders." She could sense the doubt in their expressions, a resistance to believing her words. They were used to seeing people they deemed suspicious as, in their eyes, the problem. Here she was, defying that assumption with nothing but honesty and clarity. "Do you have any ID for that organization?" the second officer asked, sounding slightly less confident now. She smiled politely and reached into her bag, pulling out a small card with her name, title, and the nonprofit's information. She handed it over. The officers examined the card closely, flipping it between their fingers. The subtle change in their body language did not escape her notice. Their stance softened slightly, their eyes flickering with uncertainty. She realized they were struggling to reconcile the woman in front of them with the assumptions they had made about her just moments ago. She felt a mix of relief and frustration. Relief because the truth was finally coming into view. Frustration because it should never have taken this much scrutiny for them to see her humanity. She remembered times in the past when she had been judged solely for her skin color, her appearance, or the neighborhoods she frequented. Those memories were painful, but she buried them deep in that moment, focusing on the here and now. As the questioning continued, one officer noticed the notebook sticking out of her bag. Without asking, he reached for it, his movements sharp and uninvited. "What's in here?" he demanded. "That's personal," she said softly but firmly. "Please don't touch it without permission." Her calm tone was deliberate, unyielding, showing that she would not allow herself to be disrespected. The officer paused, clearly irritated by her resistance. For a moment, she could see a battle of wills in his eyes. He wanted to assert control, to prove his authority, but she refused to give him the satisfaction. "You think you're better than me, huh?" he said, his voice low and sharp. She shook her head gently. "No, I'm not better than anyone. I'm just asking for respect. I want to be treated fairly like anyone else would be." Her words were steady, honest, and disarming. She did not accuse, she did not yell, but she held the ground firmly. The tension between them was palpable. Passers-by had slowed down, some stopping entirely to watch. No one intervened, but everyone could feel the injustice in the air. They sensed that something deeper was happening than a routine police stop. The woman's calm strength against the officer's assumptions was magnetic, drawing silent support from those who could see beyond appearances. Minutes passed with more questions, each one probing her story, her intentions, her identity. She answered each with patience, clarity, and dignity. She spoke of her work, her role in the community, and the goals she had for the programs she helped organize. She described the people she worked with, the children she wanted to support, and the families who relied on her efforts. Each word painted a picture of a life dedicated to helping others, a life far removed from the stereotypes the officers had projected onto her. And yet, despite her honesty, she could feel the lingering bias in their eyes. It was subtle now, but it remained, like a shadow hovering just out of reach. She knew it would not disappear overnight. Bias, once formed, could be stubborn and resistant to change. But she also knew that moments like this, moments where truth met prejudice face to face, could plant seeds of understanding, seeds that might grow over time. One officer finally broke the silence. "Why do you work so much with children? Why take on all this responsibility?" His tone had softened slightly, curiosity breaking through the tension. She looked at him, her expression calm and earnest. "Because children need guidance and support. Because families need someone to listen. to help, to advocate for them. I want to make a difference in the lives of those who might not have anyone else." Her words carried sincerity, and for the first time she saw a flicker of respect in his eyes. The second officer, still cautious, nodded slowly. "And you do all this on your own?" "I don't do it alone," she said. "Many people work together. Volunteers, educators, community members. But someone has to lead, to organize, to make sure things actually happen. That's my role. That's why I'm out here, doing this work, even late at night." Her calm, unwavering explanation seemed to pierce through some of their skepticism. The officers exchanged another look, longer this time. It was not just professional. It carried a personal weight, as if they were beginning to confront their own assumptions. The woman noticed, but she did not gloat. She did not need to. Her mission was not to shame them, but to hold her ground with dignity and truth. "Do you live far from here?" the first officer asked, his tone quieter now. "Not far," she replied. "Just a few blocks. I know the neighborhood well, and I take care to be safe." There was a pause. The officers seemed to be reconsidering the situation, their previous assumptions slowly crumbling under the weight of her calm presence and undeniable honesty. The notebook in her bag, the ID, the explanations of her work, they all painted a picture that did not match the narrative they had created in their minds when they first saw her. She felt a strange mix of relief and tension. Relief because the truth was coming to light. Tension because the moment was far from over. She knew that understanding bias took time, that one encounter would not erase years of assumptions or prejudice, but she also knew that this was a step, a beginning, a moment where someone could start to see her for who she really was rather than what they assumed. The street around them remained quiet, the city seeming to hold its breath. Cars passed slowly, pedestrians glanced over, and the soft hum of distant traffic filled the pauses between words. The woman stayed composed, her calm energy a quiet force against the subtle hostility she faced. She had survived moments like this before, and she would survive this one too, not through confrontation, but through presence, dignity, and truth. Far. One officer leaned slightly closer, his expression less guarded now. "All right, we're going to need to verify some details," he said, "just to make sure everything checks out." She nodded, knowing what this meant. They were starting to see beyond their assumptions, but they still needed proof, a reality check for themselves. She handed over what they asked for, staying polite, calm, and firm. She could feel the subtle shift in the air, a sense that the encounter was moving towards something different than what it had started as. And in that moment, she realized something important. No matter the outcome, she had stood her ground with dignity. She had refused to let fear or anger dictate her actions. She had held herself with grace, showing strength not through force but through calm, unwavering presence. She was more than the assumptions made about her. She was a human being deserving of respect, honesty, and fairness. The night seemed to pause with her. Every detail, the flicker of a streetlight, the whisper of wind, the quiet murmur of the few onlookers, felt amplified. The tension remained, but now it carried a new possibility. The possibility that truth could begin to break through, that understanding could start to form, and that assumptions could slowly be challenged. The officers were still present, still questioning, but the tone had changed. Their voices were less sharp, their posture slightly less rigid. It was a small change, subtle yet significant. The woman remained calm, ready to continue answering questions, ready to assert her identity, ready to show them the truth of who she was beyond the stereotypes and biases. And in that quiet, tense yet shifting moment, the first chapter of the night's story came to a close. Not resolved, not over, but moving toward understanding. The woman's resilience, her calm honesty, and her unwavering dignity had begun to influence the officers. They were beginning to see her as more than a passing figure on a quiet street. They were beginning to see her as a human being, complex, accomplished, and worthy of respect. The woman could feel the tension in the air beginning to shift, though the officers had not yet admitted it. Their eyes, which had once been sharp and accusatory, now carried flickers of uncertainty. The questions they asked were slower, less clipped, as if they were carefully choosing words to avoid further confrontation. Still, she knew the situation was far from resolved. They had not yet seen the truth of who she was, and until they did, the bias that had fueled their actions remained a shadow over the encounter. One officer finally sighed and pulled out a phone. "We're going to verify some information," he said. his voice softer now. There was no accusation in the tone, only a professional note of procedure. The woman nodded politely. She understood the need for verification. It was standard protocol. But she also recognized the irony. Every answer she had given had been truthful, every story accurate, yet the burden of proof was still on her. It was a heavy reminder of the world she navigated daily, where honesty was not always enough to prevent judgment. The officer typed quickly, his thumbs tapping the screen with a rhythm that seemed almost frantic. The woman watched calmly, her face serene, though inside she felt the familiar churn of nerves and hope. This was the moment where perception could finally begin to change. She had already stood strong in the face of prejudice, but now, the truth itself would be visible, undeniable, and perhaps transformative. The screen lit up with information. Slowly, carefully, the officer scrolled through, his eyes widening slightly as he absorbed what he saw. The other officer leaned over, trying to glimpse the details. "Wait, this can't be right," he muttered under his breath. There was disbelief there, mingled with a dawning sense of shame that he did not yet fully acknowledge. The woman remained silent, allowing them to process. She did not interrupt, did not offer explanation beyond what they could already see. She had learned that sometimes, silence was more powerful than words. Letting others confront the truth themselves could have a stronger impact than any argument, any protest. Her calmness was a quiet assertion of dignity, a statement that she did not need to defend her worth. It simply existed, undeniable and real. The officer's expressions were changing rapidly. Where there had been sharpness and judgment, there was now confusion, mixed with awe. They were reading about her work, her accomplishments, the community programs she led, the awards she had received for advocacy, and the influence she had in shaping policies that supported education and equality. Each detail challenged the narrative they had built in their minds just minutes ago. The woman was no longer a stranger on a street at night. She was someone who had dedicated her life to helping others, someone whose identity carried weight and respect. "Is this the same person?" one officer asked, his voice barely audible. It was more a question to himself than to anyone else. The disbelief in his tone revealed the depth of their misjudgment. He had seen her as suspicious, potentially dangerous, simply because of the color of her skin and the fact that she was walking alone. The truth now stood in stark contrast, a mirror reflecting not only her reality but also the depth of their prejudice. The woman met his gaze, calm and steady. She did not gloat, did not offer a triumphant smile. Her eyes conveyed only quiet confidence and human dignity. She had expected this moment, had prepared herself for the possibility that people would not see her for who she was until confronted with undeniable proof. Yet even now, seeing the officers struggle with their own assumptions, she felt a mix of sorrow and resolve. Sorrow for the injustice she had endured countless times, and resolve to continue showing that truth, calmness, and honesty could confront even the deepest biases. The officers continued to scroll, their disbelief growing. They discovered more details. Articles about her initiatives, interviews in local media, recognition from city leaders, and letters of gratitude from families whose lives had been touched by her work. Each piece of information peeled back a layer of prejudice, revealing the human being they had failed to see. One officer rubbed his forehead, a gesture that betrayed both frustration and shame. The other officer's hand hovered over the phone, hesitant to touch it, as if afraid that the information might somehow vanish if he acted too quickly. It says here you lead several community programs," the first officer said slowly, almost reverently. You work with families and children? You're involved in education and advocacy?" "Yes," she replied softly, her voice calm and steady. "I work with people who need support. I believe that everyone deserves an opportunity, guidance, and care. That's why I do what I do." The second officer looked up, his eyes meeting hers, and for the first time, he seemed to truly see her, not just as a figure in front of him, but as a person with accomplishments, influence, and humanity. The realization struck him suddenly, uncomfortably, like a wave crashing against a wall. He had judged her in moments based on assumptions that had nothing to do with who she really was. Now confronted with the undeniable truth, he felt the weight of his misjudgment. You're very accomplished," he said, his voice quiet, almost hesitant. It was not a compliment so much as a stunned acknowledgement. There was an edge of guilt in it, a recognition that the way he had treated her was unfair and perhaps even wrong. The woman nodded, accepting the statement without responding with anger or scorn. Her silence carried more weight than words could. It invited reflection, not confrontation. The first officer's eyes filled slightly with moisture, a reaction he could not fully control. He shifted uncomfortably, looking down at the pavement before glancing back at her. I didn't realize, he said, his tone wavering. We made assumptions. Yes, she said calmly, her voice gentle but firm. You assumed things about me based on how I look, where I am walking, and the color of my skin. Those assumptions could have had serious consequences. And they are not just yours. They are a reflection of a larger problem that affects many people every day. Her words hit with a quiet power. They were not accusatory. They were honest, human, and compelling. The officers' faces revealed the internal struggle of processing the truth, confronting their own biases, and realizing the impact of their actions. The weight of their assumptions, once invisible, now pressed down heavily on them. One officer swallowed hard, his throat tight. We judged you unfairly, he admitted, his voice breaking slightly. I don't know what to say. You don't need to say anything right now, she replied, her tone calm and measured. What matters is that you recognize it. What matters is that you understand the impact of assumptions and bias. And what matters is that you do better in the future. The second officer's eyes filled with tears, and he looked away, embarrassed. The realization that they had misjudged someone so completely was overwhelming. The shame, the guilt, the shock, they all collided in that quiet moment. For the first time, he saw not just her accomplishments, but the humanity he had ignored, the dignity he had undermined, and the potential harm that could have resulted from their prejudice. The woman watched them silently. She did not reach for pity, did not demand apologies, and did not scold them. Her presence, calm and composed, was enough to convey the seriousness of the moment. She was a living example of how bias and assumptions could blind people, and how dignity, honesty, and strength could confront prejudice without violence or anger. As they continued to process, she allowed herself a brief moment to reflect as well. She thought about the countless times in her life when assumptions had been made about her, when doors had been closed, when opportunities had been questioned simply because of how she looked or where she came from. She thought about the families she had helped, the children she had guided, and the community programs she had built from the ground up. Every achievement, every success, every act of kindness had been hard-won in a world that often judged too quickly. And yet, in this moment, there was a sliver of hope. The officers were beginning to see her truth. They were beginning to confront the prejudices they had carried, perhaps without even realizing it. It was not complete, it was not perfect, but it was a start. Look, the first officer said finally, his voice steadier, though still filled with emotion. We treated you unfairly. I don't know how to make up for it, but I see now that we were wrong. The woman nodded. Acknowledgement is the first step. Understanding and change come next. It is not about punishment or blame. It is about awareness, responsibility, and the choices you make moving forward. There was silence for a moment, filled only by the distant hum of traffic and the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. The officers seemed lost in thought, grappling with the sudden, intense confrontation between their assumptions and reality. The woman remained steady, a calm presence amidst the storm of emotions around her. Finally, the second officer spoke, his voice quiet but sincere. We should have looked beyond appearances. We should have asked questions differently. We should have treated you with respect from the beginning. Yes, she said softly, her eyes meeting his. That is all anyone can ask. Recognition, reflection, and a commitment to do better next time. That is the path forward. The weight of the encounter lingered, heavy but transformative. The officers had begun to confront the truth. The woman had maintained her dignity, and the night itself seemed to hold a sense of stillness, as if bearing witness to a lesson in humanity, empathy, and understanding. The woman straightened her shoulders, ready to continue her journey home. She had faced prejudice, endured judgment, and yet emerged with her strength intact. The officers, still processing, watched her with a mixture of awe, shame, and newfound respect. The encounter had changed them in ways they could not yet fully articulate, planting seeds of awareness that might grow over time. As she walked away, the city around her continued in its quiet rhythm. Streetlights flickered softly, casting long shadows, and the night air carried the faint hum of life in motion. She felt the weight of the evening, but also the quiet hope that moments like this could ripple outward, changing perceptions, challenging bias, and reminding everyone that dignity, honesty, and humanity could confront prejudice in ways that words alone often could not. And in that quiet, reflective moment, the story of the night took a pivotal turn. What had begun as an encounter fraught with tension, assumptions, and bias had transformed into a lesson in humanity. The woman's strength, her calmness, and her unwavering dignity had begun to open the eyes of those who had judged her. The officers were confronted with a truth they could not ignore, and in doing so, they were forced to reflect on themselves, their actions, and the choices they would make in the future. The night was far from over, and the impact of the encounter would linger for years to come. But in that moment, the power of truth, courage, and human dignity shone brightly, proving that even in the darkest moments of prejudice, light could break through. The officers stood frozen for a moment, the weight of the revelation pressing heavily on them. They could not believe how wrong they had been. Every judgment, every assumption, every harsh word had been based on nothing but appearances, nothing but bias. And now, confronted with the undeniable truth of the woman's accomplishments, influence, and dedication, they felt a mix of shame, regret, and disbelief. It was a powerful, almost suffocating feeling, and neither officer knew exactly how to respond. The woman watched them carefully, her calm demeanor unchanged, but inside she felt a quiet surge of emotion. She had faced prejudice before, but there was something profoundly human about witnessing someone's recognition of their own wrongdoing in real time. She understood that this moment could be transformative, not just for them, but for the people they would interact with in the future. The ripple of understanding could be far-reaching, changing not just their perceptions, but the way they treated others for years to come. Finally, the first officer cleared his throat, his voice shaking slightly. I don't know what to say. We were wrong. Completely wrong. We judged you unfairly, and I can't believe how badly we misread the situation. You don't need to say much, she replied softly, her voice steady and calm. What matters is that you recognize it, that you feel it, that you let it guide the way you act in the future. Awareness is the first step, but actions must follow. The second officer shifted uncomfortably, his eyes downcast. He seemed unsure where to look, how to behave. The pride that had fueled their initial assumptions now felt like a heavy burden, a weight pressing down on their shoulders. For a long moment, neither spoke, both lost in their thoughts, both grappling with the sudden confrontation between bias and reality. The woman spoke again, her tone gentle but firm. Do you understand why this was so painful? Do you understand why assumptions can be dangerous? Because what you did tonight, what many people do every day, can have serious consequences. People are judged, humiliated, and even harmed because others refuse to see them for who they truly are. One of the officers nodded slowly, his eyes glistening. Yes, I see that now. I didn't realize how much damage assumptions can cause. I never thought about it that way before. That's because it's easy to forget, she said, her voice measured. It's easy to assume that people fit a certain image, that their presence means something negative. But when you stop and truly look, when you take the time to understand, the world looks very different. You see the person behind the skin, behind the clothes, behind the momentary impression, and you begin to treat them as human beings deserving of respect. The first officer rubbed his forehead, his breathing uneven. We treated you unfairly from the moment we saw you. I feel awful about it. You should feel awful, she said gently, because it is awful. But feeling is not enough. Recognition must lead to change. You must carry this lesson with you. You must remember it every time you interact with someone who doesn't fit your expectations. The officers' faces reflected the depth of their guilt, the weight of the evening, the realization of their misjudgment, and the awareness of the pain they had caused pressed heavily upon them. It was a moment of reckoning, a confrontation with the kind of prejudice that many people carry silently, often unconsciously, but that manifests in moments like this. The woman took a deep breath, allowing the silence to stretch. She wanted them to feel the weight of their actions without feeling attacked, to confront the truth with clarity and reflection. She wanted this moment to be a turning point, not just for herself, but for them. She wanted them to understand the real human cost of bias, the way assumptions could wound, diminish, and erase the dignity of those they misjudged. Finally, the second officer spoke, his voice quieter now, filled with genuine emotion. I don't know if I can ever fully make up for what we did tonight, but I promise. I promise to do better. I will change the way I see people, the way I approach situations. I can't believe how wrong we were. You can't erase the past, she said softly, but you can change the future. You can commit to seeing people, understanding them, and treating them fairly. That is the only way to make this right. Not just for me, but for everyone you encounter from now on. The officers nodded, swallowing hard. Tears glistened in their eyes, and the woman felt a mix of compassion and quiet triumph. Compassion, because she understood that recognizing wrongdoing was painful, even when necessary. Triumph, because she had faced injustice with calm dignity, and in doing so had forced them to confront their own humanity and mistakes. For a long moment, no one spoke. The street remained quiet, the city around them moving in its usual rhythm, yet this small corner of the world felt suspended in time. The officer's pride had been stripped away, replaced with humility, reflection, and the first stirrings of awareness. The woman remained steady, her calm presence anchoring the moment, allowing them to process their emotions without fear or hostility. The first officer finally spoke again, his voice steadier, though still tinged with guilt. I don't know how often moments like this happen, where someone shows us the truth of who they are and we realize we were completely wrong. I hope I never forget this. You won't forget it if you choose not to, she said. Moments like this can shape you, teach you, and guide you, but only if you allow yourself to remember, reflect, and act differently in the future. The second officer looked up, his expression one of quiet vulnerability. We didn't just misjudge you. We underestimated the impact of our actions. We underestimated how assumptions can hurt, humiliate, and diminish someone. I see that now, and I don't know how to undo it, but I will carry this lesson with me. That is all anyone can ask, she replied calmly. Acknowledgement is the beginning. Understanding is next. And then action. Make the choice to treat people fairly, to see beyond appearances, and to act with empathy. That is the only way to prevent harm and create understanding. The officers were silent again, their faces etched with emotion, their minds grappling with the sudden confrontation between bias and truth. They had spent moments judging, assuming, and acting on prejudice, and now they were faced with the undeniable reality of their mistake. It was a heavy, uncomfortable, and transformative experience, one that would stay with them long after the evening ended. The woman took a deep breath, steadying herself. She had remained calm, composed, and firm throughout the encounter, and she felt a quiet sense of strength. This was not just about proving them wrong. It was about showing them the power of human dignity, honesty, and resilience. She had faced prejudice countless times in her life, and each experience had taught her patience, composure, and the quiet power of standing strong in the face of unfairness. She knew that the officers' emotions were raw, their guilt real, and their awareness just beginning to take shape. She did not need to push them further. The work was theirs now. The reflection, the recognition, and the change had to come from within. She had done her part by holding herself with dignity and truth, by showing them the person behind the assumptions, and by speaking calmly about the human cost of prejudice. As the silence stretched, one officer finally lowered his gaze, his shoulders slumping slightly. I don't know if I can ever fully apologize, he said quietly. I can't take back what we did, but I want to learn from it. I want to be better. That is what matters, she replied softly. Learning, growing, and choosing to act differently is the only way forward. Apologies are words, but change is action. Make the choice to change. The second officer nodded, his face wet with tears. I will. I promise, I will never judge someone like that again, without understanding them, without knowing their story. The woman allowed herself a small, gentle nod. She did not smile broadly, but there was a quiet acknowledgement in her expression, a recognition that this moment, painful as it had been, had the potential to transform not just the officers, but the people they would encounter in the future. The city around them continued, indifferent to the small drama that had unfolded on this quiet street. Cars passed slowly, pedestrians walked by, and the soft hum of distant traffic filled the pauses in conversation. But in that small corner of the world, a powerful lesson had been learned: the destructive power of assumptions, the human cost of bias, and the quiet strength of dignity, patience, and truth. The officers finally stepped back, giving her space. The weight of their guilt and realization hung heavy in the air, but the tension had shifted. It was no longer a confrontation. It was a moment of reflection, of awareness, and of potential transformation. They were still shaken, still processing, but they had begun to see beyond appearances, beyond assumptions, and into the reality of her life and accomplishments. The woman straightened her shoulders, ready to continue her journey home. She had faced prejudice and emerged with her dignity intact. She had forced the officers to confront their biases, to recognize their mistakes, and to reflect on the consequences of their assumptions. And though the path forward for them would require ongoing reflection and action, she had laid the foundation for change through calmness, resilience, and the undeniable truth of who she was. As she walked down the street, the officers watched her go, still processing the encounter, still feeling the weight of their own misjudgment. The evening air carried a sense of quiet reflection, a reminder that moments like these could change hearts and minds if people were willing to listen, to feel, and to act differently in the future. The woman disappeared into the night, her presence leaving a lasting impression on the officers, on the few onlookers who had paused to watch, and on the quiet city streets. The lesson of the evening was clear. Prejudice could be confronted, assumptions could be challenged, and the human capacity for dignity, patience, and understanding could transform even the most uncomfortable encounters. And in that quiet, reflective moment, the night itself seemed to acknowledge the power of truth, the strength of character, and the lasting impact of a single person standing firm in the face of injustice.